There is a silence that falls over the deep woods after midnight, a hush so complete it presses against your eardrums like a physical weight. If you've ever camped far from trails, far from roads, far from any other human heartbeat, you know that silence. You learn to fill it with small, comforting sounds, the snap of a twig on your fire, the rhythmic stroke of your knife against a piece of fat wood, the steady, deliberate pace of your own breathing. But what if one night that silence began to fill itself? What if you heard a second set of breaths just behind the tree line, matching yours exactly? What if you woke to find your shelter had been subtly improved by hands that left no tracks? Your camp rearranged as if something was studying your habits with a patience that spans centuries. The three people in tonight's stories are not casual weekend campers. They're seasoned bushcrafters, people who know the forest's language, who can read the age of a deer track and the mood of a coming storm. They believe the wilderness was a place of predictable patterns, of natural laws. But the deep woods hold older things than patterns. They hold presences that learn, that mimic, that wait. From the dark timber of northern Maine to the moss-hung hollows of the Olympic Peninsula, to the limestone caves of the Ozark backcountry, these three true accounts will peel back the comfortable illusion that the forest is empty. Pull your chair closer to the fire, wrap your hands around a warm mug, and listen. Because the thing that stood just beyond Arliss Hunnicutt's firelight, the voice that called Zora Bethany Keener's name in her own stolen tone, and the ancient hollow where Thaddeus P. Barlow lost an entire day to a procession that shouldn't exist, they are still out there. They have learned to love the taste of human attention. My name is Arliss Hunnicutt. I'm a registered Maine wilderness guide and a lifelong bushcrafter who spent more nights in a lean-to than in a bed. And in late September of 2024, I hiked 12 miles into the Allagash backcountry to a place I'd mapped out years ago. A small, mossy clearing beside a creek, the kind of spot where the only sound is the water threading over stones and the distant croak of ravens. And I built my usual shelter, a simple A-frame with a reflector wall, and settled in for a week of solo practice, fire lays, carving, the quiet joy of being utterly alone. The first morning, I crawled out of my sleeping bag and noticed something off. My fire ring had been rearranged. The stones stacked in a neat, tight circle, not my usual looser pattern. And the extra kindling I'd left scattered had been bundled with a strip of willow bark and laid parallel beside the pit like an offering. I figured I'd done it myself in that drowsy, half-asleep state that sometimes takes over on a long trip. But the second morning, my drying rack, a simple tripod of green branches, had been moved 10 feet to the north and perfectly balanced on 3 flat river stones. And my carving project, a spoon I'd been working from a block of birch, was finished. Sanded smooth as glass with fine sand I'd never collected, and resting on my pack with the bowl facing east. I knew then, with a cold, crawling certainty, that I was sharing my camp with something. And I spent the third day building a perimeter of tripwires and noisemakers from paracord and tin cups. But that night, as I lay rigid in my bag watching the fire die 2 embers, I heard the tripwires being dismantled one by one, the cords plucked with a gentle musical twang, and then absolute silence. I didn't sleep, and at first light, I found my shelter had been completely rebuilt, not torn down, but improved, the ridgepole stronger. The boughs layered with a tighter shingle that would have shed rain better than my own work. And pressed into the moss in front of the shelter was a life-sized human shape, outlined in peeled twigs and scraps of birch bark, posed exactly as I had been sleeping, one arm tucked under my head, legs slightly bent, and the Twig-Figure's head was turned toward the shelter, watching me as I had been watched. That evening I saw it. I had built the fire high, determined to stay awake. And around 2 in the morning, I caught movement at the very edge of the firelight, a tall, gaunt shape assembled from sticks and bark, and something dark and wet that might have been mud, or might have been something else. Standing on 2 legs, its arms long and jointed like a heron's, and it was mimicking my posture, I realized, with a lurch of pure animal terror, I was sitting cross-legged. And it had folded its twig limbs into the same cross-legged stance, and when I raised my hand to my mouth to drink from my canteen, it raised a cluster of twigs to the smooth bark-like blankness of its face in perfect synchronization. I spoke, my voice cracking. "What are you?" And it didn't answer, but its head tilted, and from the direction of the creek, my own voice came back to me, perfectly recorded, saying, "What are you?" in the exact tone I'd used, and then it added in my voice. Words I hadn't spoken, but had only been thinking. "I'm what the forest grew to fill the space where you don't belong, Arliss. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember the sudden whip of branches against my face as I sprinted through the dark with my headlamp bouncing, my pack half on, my feet finding the trail by muscle memory alone. I didn't stop until I hit the logging road 12 miles later, my lungs raw, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't hold my water bottle. I made it home, but the story doesn't end there. 2 weeks later, I drove back to the trailhead to retrieve a cache I'd left, and on the hood of my truck, arranged in a neat parallel bundle and tied with a strip of willow bark, was a collection of twigs shaped into a perfect miniature of my A-frame shelter, and beside it, a tiny stick figure was posed, sitting cross-legged, one arm raised to its faceless bark head, as if toasting a fire that wasn't there. I haven't been back to the Allagash, and I never will. But I know the thing that rebuilt my shelter is still out there. I know it remembers me, because some nights I find a single peeled twig on my porch, and it's always arranged pointing east, toward the deep woods, where a very patient student of human behavior is waiting for its teacher to return. Zora, Bethany Keener. I'm a foraging instructor and bushcraft mentor based out of Port Angeles, Washington, and in October of 2023, I decided to run a 5-day solo skills drill in the Brothers Wilderness, a dense, rain-soaked stretch of the Olympic National Forest where the moss hangs so thick from the Douglas firs that sound itself seems to die within 10 feet of its source. And the silence there isn't just an absence, but a substance, a damp wool blanket that smothers every echo. I made camp beside a creek in a grove of old-growth cedar, set up a tarp lean-to, dug a Dakota fire pit. And for the first 2 days, everything was textbook. I foraged chanterelles and oyster mushrooms, carved a bow drill set from a downed red alder, practiced deadfall traps, and slept the heavy, dreamless sleep of physical exhaustion. On the 3rd night, I was sitting by the fire after dark, journaling by headlamp, when I heard my own voice call my name from somewhere up the creek. Zora, a single word perfectly pitched, perfectly paced, and I froze with my pen still on the page because I hadn't spoken since I'd arrived, hadn't said a word aloud. I daren't. Yet that was undeniably my voice. Down to the slight Pacific Northwest inflection, the way I softened the R at the end. I called back, "Who's there?" And after a long, wet silence, my own voice returned, "Who's there?" spoken not as a question, but as a flat, echoic mimicry. And then it added, in my tone, but with a curious, experimental cadence,
"Ow."
Zora Bethany Keener, born 1987, Port Townsend. Mother's name Eleanor. First dog named Riptide. A cascade of personal information I had never spoken aloud in those woods, and I felt sick. Hollowing dread as I realized something had not just heard my voice, but had accessed my memories, pulling them out like pages from a book. I didn't sleep at all that night. I fed the fire and kept my knife in my hand and my back to the creek. And as the hours crawled toward dawn, the voice returned periodically, and no longer just calling my name, but having conversations with itself using my own vocal patterns. One iteration of my voice asking a question and another answering. And the questions were things I had been privately thinking. Is the firewood enough? Did I hang the food bag high enough? Oh, what if I twisted my ankle out here alone? And the answering voice would say in a tone of cold comfort, "Don't worry, Zora. You're never really alone out here. We've been listening since you passed the first switchback." The next morning I decided to leave, to break camp and hike out. But the trail I'd marked with orange tape was gone. The tape removed, the blazes on the trees I'd notched, with my hatchet smoothed over with fresh bark, as if the forest had healed its own wounds. And I wandered for 2 hours in widening circles until I stumbled on a structure I hadn't seen before, an old logging cabin. Its roof caved in, its walls covered in thick green moss, and inside on the rotting floorboards were pages from my journal. The same entries I'd written the past 2 nights, but the handwriting was slightly wrong, the letters too tall, the spacing too perfect, and the final entry dated that morning said, "Zora came to the cabin today, and we finally got to meet her, and she was so beautiful, and her voice was so warm, and we decided to keep her here with us, in the quiet, where the moss grows over everything, and no one ever has to leave." I looked up from those pages and saw, standing in the doorway of the cabin, a figure that was my height, my build, dressed in a tattered flannel and canvas pants identical to mine. But its face was a smooth green-brown mask of living moss, and when it spoke, it was my voice again, but layered with a chorus of other voices. Younger and older, male and female, a choir of stolen sounds that said, "We've practiced your voice for so long, Zora, and now we can finally sing." I didn't scream. I lunged past it, shoulder first, and ran through the woods with no trail, no direction, just the desperate animal need to move. And after what felt like hours, I burst onto a Forest Service road and followed it to a ranger station, covered in scratches and mud and babbling about the cabin and the moss-faced thing. The rangers searched, but they found no cabin, no journal pages, nothing but a single clean print of my boot in a patch of mud, surrounded by dozens of other prints that were almost mine, but not quite the same size. The same tread pattern, but slightly too deep, as if whatever made them was heavier than a human woman should be. I've since moved to a city where the only moss is the decorative kind in florist shops. But I still hear my own voice sometimes, just at the edge of sleep, singing a song I've never learned. And I know that somewhere in the brothers' wilderness, a moss-faced choir is still practicing my name, waiting for the day I forget to be afraid and wander back into their silent, listening woods. Thaddeus P. Barlow. I'm a retired Army survival instructor who's taught bushcraft and evasion tactics to Special Forces candidates. At Fort Leonard Wood, in the spring of 2022, set out on a personal challenge to traverse a section of the Mark Twain National Forest in southern Missouri using nothing but a knife, a fire starter, and a wool blanket, a route I'd mapped through a region of sinkholes and limestone bluffs known locally as the Devil's Chessboard. In this place, the ground itself seems to play tricks. And I'd heard the old-timers' stories about hikers getting turned around and walking in circles for days. But I was arrogant enough to think my training would keep me oriented. The first 2 days were uneventful, a steady push through Okikori Forest and cedar glades, and navigated by compass and topo map, without trouble until the afternoon of day 3, when I entered a hollow I didn't remember from the map, a perfectly circular depression ringed by ancient, twisted oaks, whose branches grew together into a lattice that filtered the sunlight into a dim green murk. And in the center of the hollow stood a single, massive stone, a limestone erratic that had no business being there. Its surface carved with spirals and handprints that looked prehistoric and disturbingly fresh. I made camp in that hollow because the light was failing, and my gut told me it was a bad idea, but my legs told me. I was too tired to climb back out, and I built a fire and settled in. And that's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, no rustle of leaves. Just a complete deadened stillness that seemed to press in from all sides, and my fire, which should have crackled and popped, burned with a low blue flame that made no sound at all, not even the hiss of sap boiling from the wood. I woke the next morning to full sunlight, but when I checked my watch, it read the same date as the day before, April 14th, and the compass needle spun lazily, never settling. And I climbed out of the hollow and hiked a mile due east, according to the sun, only to emerge at the same hollow, the same massive stone, the same arrangement of my camp from the previous evening, as if I had walked in a perfect circle, but I knew I hadn't, and a cold. Creeping realization began to settle in that the hollow was not a place I was passing through, but a place I was trapped inside. I spent the day trying different directions, different landmarks, but every path curved back to the hollow, and the sun never moved across the sky, just hung at high noon. And I realized with a sickening lurch that time itself had stalled, that I was stuck in a single, repeating April 14th. I was not alone in that loop. As dusk fell again, a dusk that shouldn't have been falling because the sun hadn't moved, I saw figures moving among the twisted oaks, a slow, silent procession of people in clothes that spanned decades. A woman in a 1920s hiking skirt, a man in a 1950s flannel and fedora, a boy in a modern-day nylon jacket, all walking with the same hollow sleepwalking gait, their eyes open but unseeing, their mouths moving in a silent litany. And they were all walking toward the limestone erratic, circling it once, twice, 3 times, and then vanishing into the stone as if it were a door. I watched this procession for what felt like hours, and then one of them, the woman in the hiking skirt, turned her head and looked directly at me, and her eyes were not empty but full of a terrible, ancient intelligence, and she spoke. Not with her mouth, but with a voice that resonated in my skull. "You've walked into the snare, Thaddeus Barlow, and the snare doesn't let go, unless you leave something behind that it wants more than your soul." I emptied my pockets, threw my knife, my fire starter, my compass, my wool blanket into a pile at the base of the stone. And the woman shook her head slowly, and the voice said, "Not things, Thaddeus. A piece of yourself, a memory, a love, a fear, something the snare can feed on while you run." I thought of my daughter, of her face when she was 6 and learned to ride a bike, of the proud, wobbling grin, and I felt the memory being pulled from me, a physical yank behind my eyes. And the hollow erupted with a sound like 1,000 people sighing in relief, and suddenly the sun moved. The fire crackled, The birds sang, and I was standing in a completely different clearing. My pack gone, my gear gone, the date on my watch, reading April 15th, and a single oaken leaf pressed into my palm with a spiral carved into its surface. I walked out of the forest that day, and I've never gone back to the Mark Twain. But I've tried to remember my daughter's first bike ride, and the memory is gone, a blank space where love should be. And I know the snare is still down there, still hungry. Still looping the same April 14th over and over, with a new procession of lost hikers being added every year, and each of them leaving a piece of themselves behind so they can run, just a little lighter, just a little emptier, until one day they won't have enough of themselves left to want to escape at all. Arliss Hunnicutt fled the Allagash with the Twig-Figure on his heels. Zora Bethany Keener sprinted through the Olympic rainforest with a moss-faced choir echoing her own voice. And Thaddeus P. Barlow walked out of the Ozarks a little emptier than when he entered. Precious memory traded for a single extra day of life. The deep woods are not empty. They are occupied by things that watch and learn and wait with a patience that predates human language. And the three people in tonight's stories learned the hard way that bushcraft skills, fire, shelter, navigation are no defense against a presence that can rebuild your camp, steal your voice, or trap you in a loop of eternal afternoon. If you're planning a solo trip into the backcountry, I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying go with respect. Go with humility. Go knowing that you are a visitor in a realm that has its own rules, its own residents, and its own long, unforgiving memory. I'm your host at True Terror Files. If these stories stayed with you, please leave a comment. Tell us which one you'd never want to face and subscribe. Hit the bell so you're here next Saturday when we open another dark chapter of American fear. Until then, keep your fire high, your ears open, and never ever assume you're alone in the woods.